Alright folks, let's start off on a light note. Just kidding, we're not doing that today. Today we're diving straight into the deep end of human depravity. Alright, we're starting way back in 4th century BC, ancient Greece, where civilization was reaching new heights and people were getting more and more curious about the world around them. Big questions were being asked. How does the body work? What are these squishy bits inside us? What does this do? Pretty reasonable questions, honestly. Greek physician Herophilus wanted answers. After getting his education at the Hippocratic Medical School in Greece, Herophilus made his way to Alexandria, Egypt, home to the greatest library in the ancient world. And, as it turns out, a ruler who was very willing to hand over condemned criminals for medical research. Herophilus and his student Erasistratus got to work. And look, you might think, okay, they dissected some bodies. A little grim, but for science, right? Nope. These were live dissections, vivisections, on living, breathing, still conscious human beings. No anesthesia because anesthesia wasn't a thing yet, meaning the subjects felt every single cut, every incision, every poke and prod, right up until they passed out from pain or bled out entirely. And Herophilus performed these in public for curious onlookers who showed up thinking it sounded interesting. To be fair, and this is a low bar, the anatomical discoveries they made were genuinely groundbreaking. Herophilus identified the nervous system, distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, and documented the brain and heart in detail that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Human dissection was outlawed shortly after their work was completed, and it wouldn't become medically acceptable again for 1,800 years. Their findings were stored in the Library of Alexandria. Then the library burned down. So we got all the atrocity and lost most of the data. Great trade. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University wanted to answer a simple question. Does prison make people evil? Or do evil people end up in prison? Simple enough question. Absolutely unhinged execution. Zimbardo recruited 24 college students, normal, psychologically healthy young men, randomly assigned half of them to be guards and the other half to be prisoners in a fake prison built in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. The plan was to run it for 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. Within 24 hours, the guards began psychologically tormenting the prisoners. Sleep deprivation, humiliation, stripping them of their identities, forcing them to wear bags over their heads. One prisoner had a complete mental breakdown by day 2. Others followed. The guards invented increasingly cruel punishments entirely on their own. And here's the kicker. Zimbardo himself got so absorbed in his role as the prison superintendent that he forgot he was running an experiment. It took his girlfriend visiting the basement, seeing grown men sobbing on the floor, and telling him point blank, what you're doing to these people is wrong, for him to shut it down. The experiment remains one of the most cited and debated studies in psychology history. Critics have since pointed out serious methodological flaws, including that guards were encouraged to be tough rather than simply observed. But the core findings, that situational power corrupts ordinary people with terrifying speed, landed like a thunderbolt in the scientific community. Nobody went to prison for it. Zimbardo got a book deal. Here's one they literally tried to hide. In 1939, University of Iowa researcher Wendell Johnson wanted to understand the origins of stuttering. His hypothesis? That stuttering was caused not by any biological factor, but by negative feedback during childhood speech development. In other words, what if you could make a child stutter just by telling them they were bad at talking? To test this, Johnson and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, took 22 orphan children from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, because orphans had no parents to say no, and divided them into 2 groups. One group received positive speech therapy. The other group was told, repeatedly and deliberately, that they had serious speech problems, that they were stutterers, and that they needed to stop talking so carelessly. Many of the children in the negative group, who had no speech issues going in, developed lasting psychological damage. Some became withdrawn. Some developed speech problems that followed them into adulthood. Johnson was so aware of how monstrous this was that he buried the study. It wasn't publicly revealed until 2001, 60 years later, when a journalist dug it up. The University of Iowa formally apologized in 2001. 6 of the surviving subjects sued and were awarded $925,000 in damages. It's called the Monster Study. The researchers gave it that name themselves. In September 1950, the US Navy sailed several ships just off the coast of San Francisco and spent 6 days spraying a massive cloud of bacteria, Serratia marsens and Bacillus globigi, directly over the city. The stated reason? To simulate a biological weapons attack and see how a real city would respond. The unstated issue: nobody told San Francisco. All 800,000 residents of the city were unknowingly subjected to bacterial exposure. Most people were fine. One wasn't. Edward Nevins, a patient at Stanford University Hospital, developed a rare Serratia infection shortly after and died. His family later sued the government, arguing the exposure caused his death. The courts ruled in the government's favor, citing national security. The Navy ran similar covert biological tests on American cities and populations more than 200 times between 1949 and 1969. Over American cities, on American citizens, without telling a single one of them. When the program was finally disclosed to Congress in 1977, the response from military officials was roughly, "Yeah, but we learned a lot." You've probably heard the name, but the reality is wilder than most people realize. Beginning in 1953, the CIA launched a covert program called MK Ultra with one goal: figure out how to control the human mind. The program ran for 20 years, involved at least 150 research programs, and operated across 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, many of which had absolutely no idea the CIA was funding the research. Unwitting subjects, including mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers, were dosed with LSD without their knowledge, sometimes for weeks or months at a time, to observe the psychological effects. Subjects were subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy cranked far beyond medical doses, hypnosis, psychological torture, and experimental drug cocktails. One of the most disturbing sub-programs involved a CIA safe house in San Francisco, where agents would lure men in off the street, dose them with LSD, and observe their behavior through a one-way mirror, while listening to jazz and drinking martinis. This ran for years. Frank Olson, a US Army biochemist, was secretly dosed with LSD by his CIA colleagues in 1953. 9 days later, he fell from a 13th-floor hotel window in New York City. The CIA ruled it a suicide. His family has contested that conclusion for 70 years and counting. When MK Ultra was finally exposed in 1977 after a Freedom of Information Act request unearthed surviving documents, because CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the bulk of the files destroyed in 1973, the Senate held hearings. People testified. Heads nodded gravely. Nobody went to prison. Alright, if the previous chapters made you uncomfortable, I want you to take a breath, because this is where it gets significantly worse. Unit 731 was a covert biological warfare research facility operated by the Imperial Japanese Army, established in 1935 in the Chinese city of Harbin. To the outside world, it was disguised as a lumber mill. Internally, it was one of the most systematically evil institutions in recorded human history. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Russian prisoners of war were subjected to human experimentation on a scale that is genuinely difficult to process. Victims, referred to by staff as maruta, meaning logs, included men, women, and children. Experiments ran the full spectrum, from the methodically cruel to the purely sadistic. Victims were placed in low-pressure chambers until their eyes hemorrhaged from their skulls. Others were deprived of food and water to document survival timelines. Some were injected with animal blood, hung upside down until they died, or were drained of blood incrementally to study loss limits. Some were dehydrated in front of industrial fans until they mummified, dying at roughly 20% of their original body weight. As Soviet forces closed in at the end of the war, Japanese officials executed the remaining prisoners and demolished the facility. The United States then offered immunity to the researchers in exchange for the data, because the information gathered from the torture and murder of hundreds of thousands of people was deemed too scientifically valuable to prosecute. The architects of Unit 731 walked free. The United States officially denied Unit 731 had ever existed for decades. Now, I want to take a moment here, because not every horrifying experiment in scientific history involves a villain. Sometimes the most bizarre and haunting story is the one nobody meant to write. That story belongs to Marie Curie. Marie Curie is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary scientists who have ever lived. First woman to win a Nobel Prize, the only human being in history, man or woman, to win Nobel Prizes in two separate scientific disciplines, physics in 1903 and chemistry in 1911. She discovered polonium and radium, coined the term radioactivity, and laid the groundwork for nuclear physics and cancer radiotherapy. The woman fundamentally changed science. She also kept radioactive isotopes in her coat pockets as a matter of routine. She stored glowing radium samples in her desk drawer at home because she found the soft blue glow beautiful and soothing. She worked with radioactive materials every single day for decades with no protective equipment of any kind, breathing in radioactive particles, absorbing radiation through her skin, contaminating her clothes, her furniture, her food, her home. Her personal research notebooks from the 1890s are still so dangerously radioactive today that they are kept in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. Researchers who wish to read them must sign a liability waiver before being allowed access. She died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, a bone marrow failure caused directly by her lifetime of radiation exposure. She knew, near the end, that her work had made her sick. She didn't stop, and she didn't regret it. What makes Curie's story so uniquely haunting and a list full of deliberate cruelty is that it contains none. There was no malice, no unwilling victim, no government cover-up, just a woman of such ferocious intellectual devotion that she became, entirely without knowing it, the long-running subject of her own experiment. And the science she was busy inventing didn't yet have the language to warn her what that devotion was slowly doing to her body. In my opinion, it is one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire history of human knowledge, and it deserves to be told alongside the monsters, not because she was one, but because it shows that science, even in the purest hands, always extracts a price. So, there you have it. Ancient physicians slicing open conscious human beings for a crowd of spectators. A psychologist who forgot he was running an experiment until his girlfriend intervened. Orphan children told they were broken just to see what would happen. The US Navy secretly spraying bacteria over an entire American city. The CIA dosing unsuspecting people with hallucinogens while sipping cocktails behind a one-way mirror. And a Japanese facility that industrialized human suffering on a scale almost too large to comprehend. History has a long, well-documented, deeply uncomfortable habit of deciding that some lives are worth less than the information that can be extracted from them. The ethical frameworks that govern science today, informed consent, institutional review boards, the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, none of them came from nowhere. They came from the world eventually looking at what had been done in the name of knowledge and saying, we have to do better than this. Whether we always have is, perhaps, a question worth sitting with. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know, which of these evil science experiments did you find the most disturbing? Which had you staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m.? And while you're down there in the comments, what topic do you want to see covered next? History, science, unsolved mysteries, conspiracy theories? Drop it below, and I'll see you in the next one.